We would like to provide a special thanks to Audible for supporting The Trail Went Cold, and we would both like to thank you, the listeners, for being such great supporters of this show. So to earn yourself a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial, please visit audible.com/cold. That's audible.com/cold. Thank you. August 29th, 1943. Indianapolis, Indiana. 33-year-old Maoma Ridings, a corporal in the Women's Army Corps, checks into a room at the Claypool Hotel. Later that evening, Corporal Ridings is found murdered on her bed after having been beaten and slashed by a whiskey bottle. Less than 2 hours earlier, a bellboy had seen a woman dressed in black inside Ridings' room, but the identity of this woman and the circumstances behind Ridings' murder remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to a special CrimeCon themed minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be time traveling back to World War II to tackle a pretty baffling unsolved crime, the 1943 murder of Corporal Maoma Ridings. And there's a good reason I chose this particular case. This past weekend, I traveled to Indianapolis to appear at the very first CrimeCon, in which I represented The Trail Went Cold on Podcast Row. I recorded this minisode before I left on my trip, but as a special surprise for all my listeners who joined me at a CrimeCon-hosted private party, I decided to deliver an exclusive live reading of the minisode to them before it was officially released, and I sincerely hope I didn't make an ass out of myself. Since CrimeCon took place at the JW Marriott Hotel in Indianapolis, I chose to chronicle an unsolved murder which took place at another establishment from the city, the Claypool Hotel, which was demolished during the 1960s and is now a business center called Claypool Court, located only a couple blocks away from the Marriott. This case was a pretty big deal at the time it took place, because not only did it involve the brutal murder of a servicewoman on American soil during World War II, but the victim also had a personal connection to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. I previously featured this case in an article I wrote for listverse.com titled 10 Creepy Hotel Mysteries Which Are Still Unsolved, which was originally published in July of 2015. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the baffling unsolved murder of Corporal Maoma Ridings. Our story begins in Indiana in 1943. Our central figure is 33-year-old Corporal Maoma Ridings, who is currently working as a physical therapist in the Women's Army Corps and is stationed at Camp Atterbury near the town of Edinburgh. Ridings was originally born as Maoma Little before she got married, and originally hails from the small town of Warm Springs, Georgia. Well, there's one notable individual who was particularly fond of the town of Warm Springs, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. As you probably know, Roosevelt was stricken with polio, which cost him the use of his legs, but immersing himself in warm weather would help him deal with the pain. He He first sought treatment for polio at a spa resort in Warm Springs during the 1920s and became so enamored with the area that he decided to purchase the resort and some surrounding property. He eventually built a home on this property which became his presidential retreat and was known as the Little White House. He also decided to turn his resort into a treatment center for polio patients known as the Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute for Rehabilitation. From 1927 until 1931, Maoma Little worked as a physical therapist there while Roosevelt was a patient. She personally treated Roosevelt, who was then governor of New York, several times, so much so that he considered her to be one of his favorite nurses. Anyway, by the time 1943 rolled around, President Roosevelt was leading the country through World War II, and Maoma Little was serving in the Women's Army Corps. She was also now known by her married name Maoma Ridings, though she had recently divorced her husband, who was now fighting overseas. On the afternoon of Saturday, August 28th, Ridings was granted leave on a weekend pass, so she took a 30-mile bus trip from Camp Atterbury to downtown Indianapolis. After buying a bottle of whiskey from a liquor store, Ridings went to the Claypool Hotel and checked into room 729 at 5 p.m. At around 8 p.m., a housekeeper arrived at room 729 to change the linen. After calling out and getting no answer to her knocks, the housekeeper unlocked the door and entered the room, where she was treated to a shocking sight. Corporal Ridings was now dead, and her body was lying on the bed, nude from the waist down. She had been beaten across the head with a blunt object. Her jugular vein, wrists, and torso were also slashed, and there was a pool of blood near her head. Strangely, it would turn out that Ridings' wrists were slashed after she was already dead, which made investigators suspect that a flimsy attempt had been made to make her death look like suicide. The murder weapon turned out to be the bottle of whiskey which Ridings had purchased earlier that day, and it was now lying broken on the floor. An autopsy would reveal that she had drunk 10 ounces of whiskey prior to her death. It would also show that Ridings had sex shortly before she was killed, though it was never publicly specified whether the sex was consensual or rape. Another odd piece of evidence was a fountain pen on the bed, which someone had used to make an ink mark on Ridings' thigh. In spite of the brutal nature of the crime, nobody from the hotel reported hearing anything, but it's worth noting that room 729 was situated in an isolated corner between two stairwells. A few days after the murder, the same housekeeper who found Ridings' body discovered that a screen from a window which led to the 7th floor fire escape had been pushed out. This seemed to indicate that the killer may have used this route to escape the hotel without being seen. While police were investigating the murder scene, the room's phone rang. One of the detectives answered it, but there was no one on the line, and the caller immediately hung up. Shortly after checking into the hotel, Ridings had ordered soft drinks and ice, and a bellboy named Robert Wolfington delivered them to her room at 5:30. However, the case took a strange turn when a second bellboy described delivering more ice to room 729 at 6:15. The bellboy claimed that when Ridings opened the door, he looked behind her to see a dark-haired woman dressed entirely in black sitting on the bed smoking a cigarette. This would turn out to be the last time Ridings was seen alive, and this mysterious woman was never identified. Now, whenever Ridings received a weekend pass and went on leave from the Women's Army Corps, it was her normal routine to travel from Camp Atterbury to downtown Indianapolis in order to check into a hotel and spend the weekend partying. Apparently, there were sightings of Ridings with a woman dressed in black at various parties around town in the weekends prior to her murder, but no one could verify who she was. Interestingly enough, Ridings had previously spent her weekend staying at another establishment called the Hotel Severin, but during her last stay there, she was asked to leave because of a noisy party, which is why she had started staying at the Claypool. Ridings was known to the staff of both hotels because she had a reputation for being a generous tipper. On the night of her murder, Ridings had tipped a quarter to both of the bellboys she saw, and interestingly enough, another quarter was found in the pool of blood next to her body. Even though Ridings usually carried a lot of money on her during her weekend excursions, a total of 46 cents was found inside her room. Since Ridings had not paid for her room in advance, and 46 cents wasn't going to cover her bill, it was assumed that the killer had taken the rest of her money. The day after the murder, There was a promising lead when a pair of blood-stained pants was dropped off at a laundry which was located a few blocks away from the Claypool Hotel. However, this turned out to be nothing more than a bizarre coincidence, as the owner was eventually found, and the blood had no connection to the murder. Amusingly enough, a newspaper article from this time period states that the owner got blood on his pants because of a quote-unquote friendly scuffle with his wife. Anyway, the strange phone call to room 729 after the murder also turned out to be a red herring. Emmanuel Fisher, another corporal stationed at Camp Atterbury, came forward and admitted to being the caller. Fisher originally had a date scheduled with Ridings that night, but he got held up. He first tried calling her room at around 7 o'clock, but got no answer. Over an hour later, Fisher tried calling Ridings' room again, but this time one of the detectives answered. When Fisher heard a male voice answering the phone, he just assumed that Ridings had found another date, and hung up without saying anything. Since Fisher was able to account for his whereabouts during the time period the murder took place, he was eliminated as a suspect. Anyway, the crime left such a vivid impression that not only did the Claypool Hotel remove the number 729 from the room in which the murder occurred, but they also wound up making sure that none of the rooms on any of the floors had the number 29. Due to Ridings' personal connection to President Roosevelt, her murder garnered a lot of publicity. But even though the Army and the Indianapolis police both worked together on the investigation, they were unable to make an arrest or close the case. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. The Trail Went Cold wants to express our deepest thanks to Audible. We are so excited that they are supporting our podcast. Audible has an unmatched selection of audiobooks, original shows, news, comedy, and so much more. Much like our podcast, their audiobooks are great to listen to in so many different situations, such as driving or getting stuck in traffic, working around the house, shopping, or working out at the gym. In fact, I recently had to take a long road trip which involved a 12-hour drive both ways, but Audible helped the time pass so much faster. Audible is currently offering you, our audience, a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. Just go to audible.com/cold and browse their unmatched selection of audio content. All you have to do is download a title for free and start listening. It's that easy. And as listeners of our podcast, you'll be very happy to know that they've got an excellent selection of true crime and mystery books. I have just personally downloaded an audiobook titled Decades of Doubt, the John McCabe Murder Saga. You know that I love featuring true crime cases in our podcast which are major rabbit holes, and this one certainly fits the bill. It chronicles the 1969 murder of a 15-year-old Massachusetts boy named John McCabe and the quest for justice which would last over 4 decades. The book is written by Eric Wilson, who served as defense attorney for one of the suspects who was eventually charged with the crime, and he chronicles the troublesome case against his client and why this story is steeped in controversy. Decades of Doubt, the John McCabe Murder Saga, is a riveting story of a case I had never heard of before, and I could not stop listening to it. I highly recommend it for true crime fans like yourself. So remember, to get a free audiobook like this one with a 30-day free trial, please go to audible.com/cold. That's audible.com/cold. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the show. So who would have had a motive to murder Corporal Ridings? Well, we know Corporal Fisher was eliminated as a suspect, and since Ridings' ex-husband was serving overseas at the time, it obviously couldn't have been him. However, there were a few other potential suspects, such as Robert Wolfington, the bellboy who delivered the soft drinks and ice to Ridings' room at 5:30 p.m. that night. There were some discrepancies when Wolfington tried to account for his whereabouts between 5:30 and when Ridings' body was discovered at 8. However, after being questioned for several hours, police became convinced he likely wasn't involved, and released him. However, there was another promising suspect who worked at the Claypool Hotel, a kitchen worker named Robert de Armand, who had a prior conviction for attempting to rape a 10-year-old girl, and had actually been released from an insane asylum only 4 months before the murder. De Armand also had a large scratch on his left hand and had trouble providing a consistent account of his whereabouts on the night of the crime. In addition to working at the hotel, De Armand had a night job working at an amusement park. He did report there for work at 7:34 p.m., but since Ridings was last seen alive at 6:15, he still would have had enough time to commit the murder and head to work. However, there was no evidence to charge De Armand with anything. In 1944, William Llewellyn, who was in the midst of serving a prison sentence for burglary, confessed to murdering Ridings and claimed that his ex-wife was the mysterious woman in black. However, Llewellyn later changed his story and claimed that he lied about his ex-wife's involvement. He attempted to plead guilty to the murder, but a judge did not find his confession to be credible and refused to accept his guilty plea. I couldn't find any follow-up to this in any of the newspaper articles I searched through, but I guess the authorities ultimately decided that Llewellyn wasn't responsible. In 1951, a man named Robert Austin Watts was executed for the murders of 2 Indianapolis women from 4 years earlier. Prior to his execution, Watts was looked at as a possible suspect in 3 other unsolved Indianapolis murders, including that of Corporal Ridings, but even after he was questioned, he never confessed to any of them. Now, the most unusual suspect is probably a man named Jack Anderson Wilson, who is the subject of a book called Corroborating Evidence, written by William T. Rasmussen. Rasmussen believes that Wilson was behind the Black Dahlia murder and that police were close to arresting him before he was killed in a hotel fire in 1982. The book makes an attempt to pin several unsolved crimes on Wilson, including the murder of Maoma Ridings, because Wilson was apparently in Indianapolis at the time of the murder and left town right after it happened. Well, here's the problem. Rasmussen also theorizes that Wilson was a cross-dresser and that the mysterious woman in black might have actually been him in drag. Okay, at the time, investigators did acknowledge the possibility that the woman might have actually been a man impersonating a female, but just go online, look up a photograph of Jack Anderson Wilson, and try to picture that guy in drag. He would probably be one of the least convincing female impersonators of all time, and I don't think Corporal Ridings would be letting him in her room. So I really wouldn't put too much stock in this theory. I have a feeling that the killer was probably none of the suspects I just mentioned. Now, when I first heard about this story and the sighting of the woman in black, my initial thought was that this might have been some sort of lesbian affair gone wrong. Ridings was a divorcee who liked to go out and party a lot, and there were sightings of her with a woman in black at these parties. So it's certainly possible she could have gotten involved in a lesbian relationship, and given this was 1943, it's understandable that she would keep something like that under wraps. However, the autopsy revealed that Ridings had sex shortly before her death. It was never revealed whether the sex was consensual or rape, but given the brutal nature of this crime, and the fact that Ridings' body was found nude from the waist down, I'd say it's likely that she was sexually assaulted immediately before she was murdered. But either way, this means there had to have been a man in that room at some point that night. Unless this man had consensual sex with Ridings and happened to leave the room before the woman in black committed the murder, or the woman happened to leave the room before the man committed the murder, there had to be at least 2 people involved in this crime. Since there were only 46 cents left behind in the room, and Ridings was known for carrying large amounts of money during her weekend excursions, this seems to indicate robbery. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that robbery was the primary motive for this crime, as investigators did not rule out the possibility that Ridings was murdered for other reasons, but the perpetrator decided to steal her money to make it look like a robbery. Now, since Ridings loved to go to downtown Indianapolis and party every weekend, it's certainly possible that she became involved with, or caught the eye of, someone dangerous who decided to kill her. The part which doesn't seem to fit is the fact that Ridings had scheduled a date that night with Corporal Emmanuel Fisher. If Ridings had a date with him, then why was this woman in her room? We know that Fisher wasn't involved in the murder, and it doesn't sound like he knew who this woman was, so there's no reason to believe he's withholding anything. Well, I'm not sure the exact time Ridings and Fisher planned to meet for their date, but Fisher claimed he got held up and was unable to call Ridings' room until 7 o'clock, at which point she may have already been dead. It's confirmed that Ridings checked into the hotel at 5 o'clock, and the woman was seen in her room at 6:15, So I guess if Fisher was running very late, Ridings might have assumed he wasn't going to show up and called up a female acquaintance of hers to meet her in her room. There's no indication that a man was in Ridings' room when the bellboy delivered ice to her at 6:15, so it seems like an unknown male may have shown up shortly thereafter before the scene escalated into violence. Well, there are numerous possible scenarios about what might have happened. If Ridings was involved in an affair with this woman, she probably wasn't planning to see her on this particular night, but when Fisher didn't arrive for their date, she decided to call her female friend and ask if she would meet her at the hotel. Since their meeting wasn't scheduled ahead of time, this woman may have had a husband or a boyfriend who became suspicious and decided to follow her. He eventually arrives at room 729, discovers his spouse inside with her female lover, and then snaps by sexually assaulting and murdering Ridings. He then steals her money to make the scene look like a robbery before he and his female spouse flee the hotel, likely by using the fire escape. The woman may not have had any direct participation in the murder, but her male companion frightens her into staying silent. Or it's possible there was no lesbian affair at all. This woman may have just been a friend or an acquaintance of Ridings, but both she and her male accomplice collaborated to murder her. In fact, maybe robbery really was the motive for this crime, but its brutal nature does suggest something personal. Whether the woman in black orchestrated the crime, was a willing participant, or just a frightened, helpless victim, it's apparent that at least 2 people were in that room when Ridings was killed, and know the full truth about what happened. I know that over 70 years have passed, and that everyone involved is probably dead by now, but I'd like to think that no case is unsolvable. So if by chance you have any information about the unsolved murder of Corporal Maoma Ridings, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my supporters out there, particularly those of you who came to see me at CrimeCon and attended my private party to witness me narrate this minisode live and in person. The only reason CrimeCon provided this party for us to begin with is because a lot of you used the Trail Went Cold special promo code to purchase tickets to the event, and that's a pretty good indication of what a loyal and devoted fan base I have. So a big thanks to all of you who traveled to Indianapolis to see me, and since there are plans to have CrimeCon here again next year, I very much hope to return. I also need to provide a big thank you to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who is responsible for composing our eerie music score. We've also got a pair of listeners who have just signed up for recurring monthly donations, and their names are Brian and Laura. So thank you very much, guys. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.